Hello, Sean Anthony.
Hi.
This is part two. Really good to be with you on exploring the Quran and the Bible. You are professor of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University, author of a number of books, which we're going to speak about in a moment, but you can see them in front of us. Very important translation and edition of an early historical work on the life of the Prophet, all sorts of studies. So I want to speak about the Prophet and actually get right into some major debates over the Muhammad of history. We spoke a little bit about this in our first episode on exploring the Quran and the Bible, but just as sort of a reminder maybe, you hear sometimes that the Medinan period of the Prophet's life, so from 622 to 632, when the Prophet is in Yathrib, or what becomes known as Medina, like there we have some historically verifiable, authentic accounts. But some people would say that for the Meccan period, we're much less certain. Do you agree with that basic division?
Yeah, I think more or less that's right. It's sort of the deeper that you try to plumb the well of historical memory, the more obscure and dark it becomes.
Okay.
So, and part of the reason, there's a couple of reasons why this would be the case. Number one, not a lot of people live long enough that were old enough to remember the earlier portions of the Prophet Muhammad's life.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
By the time things started to be written down. And another reason for this as well is that the Medinan period is very easily divided in between the expeditions and the main kind of conflicts that happen as Medina begins to rise to power as Arabia's premier city-state, essentially. And so each of the main thematic battles, whether they be Badr or Uhud or Khandaq or the conquest of Mecca or whatever,
Right.
It's just a very simple armature around which you can build and organize historical memory. So it feels better structured. It feels like it kind of makes more sense.
Okay. So, for example, in this, it's a chance to speak about this book.
Yeah.
So you edited a really important work that comes from the same period of time, more or less, but maybe you could clarify, of the famous Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. So this is the Maghazi of Ma'mar ibn Rashid. So really important volume. Everyone should buy it. It has not only the Arabic text, but the English translation, along with an introduction. What do you think? What could you tell us about this book? I mean, if I remember, Ma'mar's book, at least maybe in the manuscripts, it doesn't proceed sort of chronologically in the Prophet's life. It seems to be sort of discrete reports, which are kind of bunched together.
Yeah.
Does that tell us anything about, I don't know, like the historical memory of the community? What would you say about that?
Yeah. So Ma'mar ibn Rashid, he's originally from Basra. And the type of materials that we have attributed to him kind of span the gamut of the earliest genres of Arabic writing that survive, right? That we call like the Hadith corpus in general. So this would be tafsir. So this is the exegesis of the Quran. Most of that material he transmits, it's from his teacher Qatada, a Basran scholar. And then he has his Hadith material that appears in a book called Jami', which I didn't translate. And then we have the Maghazi, the expeditions. Most of his traditions actually are from a teacher that he shared with Ibn Ishaq, actually. Okay. And this is a Medinan scholar by the name of Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, who dies in 742, if memory serves. And so what we have here is one of our earliest attestations to Medinan historical memory. But like you said, it's not really in order, per se. It feels more like a dossier of historical events. Okay. And you have some passages where Zuhri will make a comment on this happened first, then this happened after that, and this happened after that. Okay. But there is no attempt, it seems, to give it this overall large historical structure, which makes him very interesting to compare to Ibn Ishaq. So this is a short work. It's very brief. But Ibn Ishaq's, his original work, we don't have the entire thing. We have an abbreviation. But his original scope of his work, as far as we can tell, really was almost a universal history. It began with the creation of the world.
Right.
And then it culminates with the era of the Caliphate, and the middle part is the life of the Prophet Muhammad, right? And his work is, compared to anything else that had been up to that point, magisterial in terms of its structure and everything like this.
Okay.
There's no sense that Ma'mar is trying to create something like this at all. It's sort of like a dossier of text.
Okay. Is there added value, though, there with Ma'mar? I mean, are
Yeah,
there differences with Ibn Ishaq or added
Yeah.
material that you
There
don't
is
find in Ibn Ishaq?
differences. So there are really significant differences, and especially in terms of chronology. So one of the reasons why it's important, and this is also important for another person whose work has recently been discovered and published in part, who's also a contemporary of these guys, Musa ibn Uqba, is we used to think that Ibn Ishaq, number one, and the abbreviated form of Ibn Ishaq by this guy named Ibn Hisham was sort of like our only access to this early moment in Arabic historiographical memory, right? And so he was a bottleneck. And so with people like Ma'mar, even though he might not have the literary chops of Ibn Ishaq,
Yes.
and people like Musa ibn Uqba, the bottleneck is no longer an issue. So not only do we have one version, but we get a sense of an entire sort of historiographic school that I would locate in Medina in the late Umayyad period. And the thing that's interesting about its historical memory issue, notice, is there's a lot more Medinan material than there is Meccan material. I don't think this is just merely because of the bias of the Medinans themselves. I think it really is because that's what they seem to probably know, or at least assume that they know more about.
Right.
And I think it's also notable that's almost the inversion of what we get in the Quran. Although the Medinan sources are longer, we have less Medinan material than we have Meccan material, if you buy into that division, right? So taking that, right? So yeah, I think that now we're at a point where we can see how this historiographic school took form, and where different members of that school departed from one another. Like the most prominent thing, maybe the first thing that people would notice if they start reading Ma'mar bin Rashid is Ma'mar transmits this early account of the Prophet Muhammad's birth in the opening pages. And his birth does not correspond to the year of the elephant. Okay, so and what is the year of the elephant? The year of the elephant is this famous story where this the ruler of Yemen, this guy by the name of Abraha, undertakes all of these expeditions into Inner Arabia, and according to early Arabic historiography, he marches against Mecca with this elephant troop, with a troop with an elephant in it, and God miraculously protects Mecca from being destroyed. This is
connected to Surah 105, Surah Al-Fil, traditionally, and
exactly. And Mecca is protected, and the year that happens is, according to Ibn Ishaq, the year that the Prophet Muhammad was born, usually put at 570. In Zuhri's account, the elephant incident happened years prior to not just the Prophet Muhammad's birth, but also prior to his father's birth as well.
Okay.
So
which would actually match, because
it matches better.
We know from inscriptions that there was an Abraha that he really did have campaigns into Central Arabia. Although we don't have any record of the campaigns to Mecca. But I believe those are dated to 550-ish, something like that. 550-ish,
maybe the upper limit in the early 560s.
Okay.
If memory serves. But yeah, it does actually match what we know from inscriptions a lot better, which is interesting.
Okay.
And so little things like that will change. But for the most part, to really notice the differences, I think you kind of have to have an eye for pretty granular detail.
Got it.
The other really prominent thing, for example, is usually associated with the three major thematic battles that happen in Medina, Badr, Uhud, and Khandaq. For each of those, you have, followed the Ibn Ishaq material, exile of one of the Jewish tribes of the Yathrib. So there's three. There's the Banu Nadir, the Qaynuqa, and the Qurayza. The Qaynuqa do not feature at all in the early Zuhri material.
Okay.
And so that whole incident seems to be entirely invented by Ibn Ishaq, as far as I can tell. So there's like little things like this that
Could sort of
show up.
cross-check and
Yeah.
discern what
Yeah.
is actually Zohar.
Yeah, which of course is an entirely different question of whether or not any of this is
Actually
history,
took place.
or took place, and
Okay.
things like this. Yeah,
Yeah, so I want to ask about that question, what tools
Yeah.
a historian uses to determine what really took place.
Yeah.
Obviously, Muslim historians are doing this from a very early period
Yeah.
and debating over which akhbar or reports are authentic, which are not. I mean, even Ibn Ishaq, I remember there are times where he says, "Oh, I heard this from someone whose reliability I do not doubt," or he'll say something that seems to be a little more putative or questionable, where he'll say, "I've heard from some people." So he seems to discern different levels or different sorts of reports.
Yeah.
But a historian today working with this material, I mean, what do you think, for example, of the so-called criterion of embarrassment in trying to sort through the life of the historical Muhammad?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think this is used generally as in the historian's
Yeah.
toolbox. You know, something that makes Muhammad look bad
Yeah.
must be historical.
Yeah.
This is going to sound shocking to
Yeah.
some people, but this is the idea.
Yeah.
Must be historical because if it didn't really happen, the community which wants to make Muhammad look good
Yeah.
would have erased it or covered it up.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
The problem is you have to show that they found it embarrassing in the first place.
Okay,
And that's a real big
classic
challenge.
example
Yeah.
is the satanic verses.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So this idea that Muhammad was somehow confused or deceived by
Yeah.
Satan, who managed to whisper some verses of the Quran allowing for a concession to
Yeah.
polytheism, which Muhammad thought was from God,
Yeah.
and it wasn't. And the traditional approach, at least of Western scholars,
Yeah.
is, well, this must have taken place
Yeah.
because it's so embarrassing
Yeah.
that it must be true.
Yeah. So as far as I'm kind of on a bit. So he's a bit of. So the main person that wrote the big monograph on is the late Shahab Ahmed.
Yes.
And he kind of waffles on his view of it too, which I'm about to do as well. I'm not 100% certain that this was a story that was found to be embarrassing when it was first articulated, but only subsequently became embarrassing, as far as I can tell. So to me, that the criteria of embarrassment doesn't help us out with that
Okay.
one.
Okay. I tend to agree with
Yeah.
you, by the way.
The one that I think perhaps it works best for is the issue with Zayd. I think the Zayd issue is a real good example of the criterion of embarrassment at play.
Okay.
And so the Zayd story is where the Prophet Muhammad is commanded by God to annul his adoption of this figure named Zayd ibn Haritha. And not only does he have to annul the adoption of Zayd, but he also has to allow Zayd to dissolve his marriage to his wife. And then the Prophet Muhammad then marries his quote-unquote son's wife.
Zainab.
Yeah, Zainab. And so this is more or less narrated in its entirety in the Quran. It's not clear in every single passage what exactly is going on and things like that. But I think this was originally very early on a difficulty. And it was something that is mentioned in a lot of very early texts of like an example of a difficult or scandalous Quranic revelation.
So do you think that the criterion of embarrassment may not hold for certain reports because the early historians had not developed the principle of Muhammad's infallibility? Do you think
Yeah.
that comes later, basically, and they had a different way of thinking about the Prophet? Maybe they didn't see the principle of infallibility as a necessary safeguard of the claims of his, the reliability of his revelation. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that the narrators themselves were their theological understanding of prophecy and what it requires and all that stuff was perhaps naive, inchoate. So, like, there's all sorts of ways.
Even it doesn't have to be naive. I mean, think of
Yeah.
the Jewish and Christian affirmation of David's role as someone
Yeah.
who is a prototype for the Messiah, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
And yet he kills Uriah.
exactly. Has adultery with Bathsheba.
Yeah. I think that's definitely the case, to where you have these evolving doctrines. And it's interesting, you definitely get this in the Quran as well, where you have prophets doing things that seem to be beneath what prophets do, right? So can Abraham lie, for example?
Right.
So this creates a theological problem.
The big one did it.
Yeah, the big one did it. So it's, oh my God, you have a prophet that is lying, and so is this allowed? And how can you explain this? Of course, a theologian's job is to explain this, and
Yes.
if you can't explain it, then you're a bad theologian, and there are many theological ways to explain this. So yeah, I think that this is where the criteria of embarrassment is more or less most at play, is when you have some sort of theological doctrine that evolves over time, and then after it has coalesced, there's all these little places that things don't quite create a good fit for that doctrine, and so they have to be accommodated in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Quran itself definitely plays down some of the bad behavior
I think
of
it's
the
already
characters,
there.
principally from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. But I don't think it erases it. Like, I don't see the Quran being dogmatically opposed to the possibility that these figures could sin. So, I mean, what we would usually call sin, this is theological, so it's complicated to speak about it in a non-theological way. But there's even allusion, I think, to David's behavior and repentance with Bathsheba. When it speaks of him bowing down prostrate in repentance, he's repenting for something.
Exactly.
So, I would say that. I think also, with other cases as well, and as you say, Moses killing an Egyptian, but then there are theological explanations, maybe it was before he was a prophet and things like that. Okay, so I want to get on to another of your books and speak about another controversial topic. And that's your first book, I think, is this one?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is The Caliph and the Heretic, Ibn Saba and the Origins of Shiism, published by Brill. I won't quiz you on what year it was done. I'm just going to look it up. 2012 by Brill. This is a complicated topic and sensitive one because if I understand correctly, it's about the polemical stories regarding Ibn Saba and the origins of Shiism.
Yeah. So basically, it's a study of an account of a heresy arc. So he's ostensibly supposed to be the person that invents the first heretical movement in Islam, and of course, this is written from more or less what we call a Sunni perspective, and so the heresy that he invents is Shiism, and the idea. Basically, there's this guy named Ibn Saba. He's a Jewish man from Yemen, and he fakes his conversion to Islam, and he tries to then infiltrate the Muslim society and to raise a rebellion and sow discontent against the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan.
Okay.
And ostensibly, he is successful in doing that by forming this cabal against him in the provinces. And then these figures then march upon Uthman and they assassinate him, they kill him. How did he do it? So he did it by essentially creating or inventing Shiism, the belief that Ali should have been the first and was the only kind of deserving successor of the Prophet Muhammad after his death. And he does so by ostensibly introducing Jewish ideas into Islam where they don't belong. And so for Ibn Saba, for example, is said to have introduced the idea that Ali ought to have been the successor to Muhammad, just as Joshua ought to have been the successor to Moses, and so on and so forth. It's obviously it's a black legend. It's a tale that is more interesting in terms of the formation of historical memory and how those sorts of processes happen. I became interested in it because the person that invents this story, a historian by the name of Saif ibn Omar, was strongly influential on the figure is probably the most important early Muslim historian, a guy by the name of Abu Ja'far al-Tabari.
Yes.
He models Ibn Saba after an account of the Apostle Paul. And so he sees Paul as having done to Christianity very much what Ibn Saba attempted to do to Islam. So the reason why Christianity went wrong and Christian division arose and Christians lost contact with the true, authentic message of Jesus is because this figure, Paul, infiltrated them. And
Also, is he called explicitly a Jew? Is the
yes,
Jewishness also
yeah,
an issue here?
he is.
Okay.
So, I mean, the story goes that he gets... So this actually appears in Jewish sources as well, in a series of story cycles called Toledet Yeshu.
Yes.
And so it's probably taken from these Jewish sources, actually.
Okay.
Even though it's a bit difficult to date.
So that's intriguing. So it's
Yeah.
wrong to think of it just as an anti-Semitic
Yeah.
fantasy. So
Yeah.
Jewish sources themselves are explaining the rise of Christianity
Yes.
through this character,
Yes.
Paul.
Yeah. Which I would say, I would also even say that this story is probably even based on an even earlier one from Kalila Wadimna about the conflict between the crows and the owls. And so I'll tell that story real fast so that you get the idea that crows and owls are constantly fighting each other, famously so. And so the owls humiliate the crows, and the crows are kind of at a loss. What are we going to do? And so the Sultan of the Crows, he goes to his vizier crows, and he says, we need a strategy. And one of the viziers says, what I need you to do is to treat me like an outcast and pretend as if I'm kicked out of your court. And I'm going to seek refuge with them, and then I'll come back and tell you their secrets and on how to defeat them. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do. They beat up the crow, and they send him off to the owls, and the owls gains the trust of the owl. Sorry, the crow gains the trust of the owl king.
Yes.
And then he secretly goes back to the crows and tells them how to kill all the owls. And they sneak up on the owls, and they all burn them alive in a cave. And so that's is more or less what happens with the Paul story, where he finds a way to persecute the true Christians of Jesus, the true followers of Jesus,
yes.
and to kind of undo the true
yes.
teachings. And more or less, this would have happened to the Muslims too, but Ibn Saba ultimately fails at his main aim. He does succeed in causing havoc, but he does not succeed in destroying the religion of Islam or the Caliphate or anything like that.
And so, I mean, this is one way maybe of defending Uthman's legacy.
Yeah.
Is telling the story about Ibn Saba.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because so Uthman is very controversial. He reigns for 12 years, 6 good, 6 bad is the traditional thing. And in the 6 bad, he does these things called the ahdath, or these are the innovations or the bad things that he introduces that contravene the law and the practice of the Prophet and his 2 predecessors, Abu Bakr and Omar. And in other historical accounts, these are the things that the rebels bring before Uthman and ask him to repent of. And the conflict is a bit involved, but long story short, eventually things come to a head, and he is assassinated in his home in Medina. And that chaos eventually leads to Ali arising as the 4th caliph.
According to some reports, while he's reading from a Mus'haf.
Yeah,
is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, from the Mus'haf that he compiled. So the real question for Saif ibn Umar, the guy that creates the Ibn Saba thing, is are any of these claims against Uthman true? He was actually not a Sunni. He was something called an Uthmani. It gets really into the weeds to go into this stuff. But just put it very simply, he was all in on Uthman being a great guy. And his historiography...
Hence the name Uthmani?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And he kind of writes his history as a way to show that Uthman was the greatest guy ever, and everything that was said against him more or less was due to the evil doings and the nasty things that Ibn Saba was spreading against him.
I mean, this, unfortunately, I've seen reflections of this idea that the Jews and the Shia are somehow partners. I mean, it's just something I saw on Twitter where a Sunni site posted an image of an Orthodox Jewish man praying in a Shiite mosque. I think in the U.S. I think, maybe. And did a lot of comments about, this makes perfect sense. That the Shia would let this Jewish man pray.
I mean, this is a common heresiological trope. It's a common sectarian polemic, right? So, we have the pure version of the religion, and this sectarian group or another they are contaminated by the ideas of outsiders. So,
Okay.
like famously, the Qadariya, these are the people that believed in free will in late Umayyad period. They're thought to be influenced by Christians. They got the idea from Christians. And the Shiites, they got the idea of Ali succeeding Muhammad. They got it from Judaism. And like later on, another figure, Al-Jahiz, he blames the Hanbalis for their anthropomorphism. He says, oh, you got that from the Jews, right? And so, like, it's just a very common thing. Just like, I guess in Christian heresiology, they talk about Judaizers and things like this.
Yeah, and I think even, don't the Ash'ariya call the Mu'tazila the new Zoroastrians because they have two sources of, like, humans and God can be the origin of acts. So there's sort of a... yeah, and so, I mean, speaking then more as a critical historian, I mean, my guess is you would think it's wrong then to portray sort of Sunnism as like the original Islam and Shiism as a deviation. I mean, am I right about that? That's not how you would...
I mean, it's just, in general, historically speaking, you try to avoid teleology. Like, so the idea that things inevitably lead to something or tend towards something. For me, both Sunnism, Shiism, Khawarijism, whatever, they are all... I don't adjudicate their differences theologically, but they are all reasonably understood as byproducts of the rise of Islam. Like I say, they both come from the same source, essentially.
What about this idea that I think is connected to a book written by Patricia Cronin, maybe with Martin Hines, on the Caliphate?
Yeah, the Caliph, God's Caliph.
God's Caliph.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And, I mean, they sort of say that it's actually the Shia who have preserved the more primitive, in the sense of early understanding of leadership, of imama, because we think, based on the sources, that the early caliphs understood themselves as having not only political but religious authority as well. And I think they attest to some sources where the early caliphs are spoken of as Khalifatullah instead of Khalifat Rasulullah, so the caliph of God, or the representative of God, instead of the successor of the messenger of God. So that kind of flips everything around.
So I think that the book has a lot of merit to it. I think that when you look at how the early caliphs viewed themselves and their role, it was very robust in terms of their authority on just about all matters. And it does very closely resemble Shiism in some way, what we associate with Shiism.
It's just the idea of the imam sort of having that religious authority continuing.
It's not just that. So what I would add to that is the idea that your salvation is dependent upon having a very, an actual connection with an imam. So Shiites would refer to this as walaya or whatever. And then, in other words, you have to tether yourself to a rightly guided imam, a source of a guidance. Otherwise, you have really no hope of salvation in the afterlife. So, I mean, there's a famous hadith that says if you die without an oath of allegiance to a caliph, a bay'ah on your neck, then you die the death of a pagan, right? And so this sort of idea that your attachment to this political institution has profound implications for your fate in the afterlife is, it seems to me, there from the very beginning. Of course, it's very important for the Shiites because you have to have the right imam and don't be confused in thinking that it's the caliph who actually rules in power, but it's actually this certain line or whatever. But yeah, the Umayyads are very in on that as well.
Well, I mean, it makes sense to me, this vision of Shiism, in part because, I mean, I've had students, for example, say, like, how does it work with Sunnism that God guides the world sort of from Adam, from creation, up to 632, then Muhammad dies, and sort of the guidance is over. Of course, Sunnis have answers to that. They would say, well, the ulama somehow communicate Muhammad's Sharia, so they continue to guide. But, I mean, there's a compelling vision for Shiism, which is, no, like, God has a ministry or dispensation after the age of the prophets, which is the age of the Imams, and of course some flavors of Shiism, like the Ismailiyah, think that continues, or at least some of the Ismailiyah think that continues into the present day. Okay, I want to touch on two other books. We've spoken about these two books before in our first episode, so we won't go into depth. But there's this book on crucifixion. So pretty, grisly stuff. Crucifixion, Death, the Spectacle, Umayyad Crucifixion in its late antique context. And I remember in our conversation before, you explained that, sort of the problem is, was there crucifixion at all after Christianity sort of arises? Christians, in principle, shouldn't like crucifixion because Jesus was crucified.
Yeah.
They use the cross, obviously still today, as sort of the principal symbol of the religion. And yet here in the Quran and in historical accounts of pretty prominent Muslim figures, crucifixion is there. So a word or two about that?
Yeah. So that it started off with the same basic question. I was kind of reading in sources where people were crucified ostensibly, and wondering what the heck does this mean in this context.
Right.
And what I basically learned was
it's just to connect the two conversations.
Yeah.
One of the figures who's crucified, I think, is connected to one of the Zaydi
So
imams.
Zayd bin Ali is crucified. Yeah.
Okay.
Zayd
Zayd himself, the
famous
Zaydiyya,
Zayd,
fifth.
Yeah, the namesake of the Zaydiyya.
Okay.
He was
okay.
crucified by Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik. So they made Caliph.
Okay.
And he.
But that doesn't mean. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
sorry.
But that doesn't mean people who know the story of Jesus in Christian sources would think of crucifixion according to the Passion of Christ, where he's killed by being nailed to a cross. But
sometimes people were.
Okay.
Okay. So it's not. So okay. Crucifixion, one, we have to decouple it from Christian iconography.
Yeah.
Even Roman crucifixion and non-Roman crucifixion in the ancient world was much more diverse than what we think about when we think about Christian iconography.
Okay.
The Romans seem to be more or less unique, or at least the most prolific in terms of using the crucifix as sort of a machine of death, a way to kill somebody. But usually crucifixion was just being attached to any sort of board.
For display.
Yeah, for display after death. But also, you do get examples of people being attached to some sort of wooden implement and then shot through with arrows, impaled by a spear, cut in the side with a knife, like you name it, whatever grisly thing, whatever. And then the body is left there.
Okay. And
so
that's kind of the point.
Yeah,
the
key
display.
thing, So in the book, what I describe it as like the inversion of Muslim burial. So if you want to ultimately exclude someone from a community in the most radical way, then you deny them sort of the final rights and sort of the sacred and the solemn rights that kind of accompany a Muslim when they're interred in the ground by their family members and their loved ones, etc., at the end of their life. And so just about every single aspect that you can imagine that comes with this kind of the solemn act of both the janazah, the funeral, and the burial are inverted with the crucifixion.
That's a really intriguing way to put it.
And
that's
so,
very interesting.
In essence, I was trying to see what did it look like, what was it used, and that's more or less
that's really
conclusion.
really terrible, right?
Yeah.
Religiously, obviously.
Yeah.
The killing of someone.
Yeah.
But also religiously, when you speak of it as an inversion of what would be proper burial, and presumably it's connected to ideas of divine judgment, like
the idea comes from it's a Quranic had punishment, so it's a punishment for hiraba, which is like brigandage, basically.
Okay.
So highway robbery, but this also applies to rebelling against the state.
Yeah, but there's a verse too about creating war against God and His prophet, right?
Yeah,
I think
it's like spreading fasad in the land. And Yarabun Allah wa Rasuluhu. And also it's interesting. It has a litany of punishments in the Quran. That include crucifixion, but also include, having your hands cut off and your legs cut off hands and foot cut off from opposite ends.
Opposite sides.
The Quranic verse, it's kind of getting a bit of the weeds, but it's very interesting. But because when it lists those punishments, it says or rather than and.
Okay.
And so how you interpreted that legally was
divided
quite involved.
The schools.
But in any case, in terms of the crucifixion itself. In the early period, it seems to me that it was used both in the older Roman way of a way to kill someone, like you attach them and then you kill them, and also the way to display dead bodies.
Okay.
I ended it with the Umayyad dynasty because when the Abbasids take over, they actually exhumed the bodies of the dead Umayyad caliphs, and they crucified their dead bodies in order to exact revenge for crucifying people like Zayd and other Hashemites as well.
Okay.
And it's a very prominent scene in a lot of kind of literary sources, this kind of the crucifixion of the dead bodies of the Umayyads.
Okay. And
But
this wasn't too depressing
yeah,
working on this project?
I know. It was extra. Yeah, I put I limited the chronological scope as much as I could. But the thing that does seem to happen is, as time goes forward, using crucifixion as a means to kill someone disappears, and crucifixion in Islamic law seems predominantly to be either hanging someone or to leave their body in a gibbet or in some kind of cage or some sort of structure where it's displayed and not buried. So it's kind of a way to deny someone burial rather than a means to actually kill somebody. And then there's discussions of when can you hand the body back over to the relatives for actual burial and things like that, and whether or not there's a time period and all sorts of things like that.
Right, right.
And other key things I would say is, so crucifixion of that type did even survive in the Christian Roman period. I mean, they don't have the T-cross anymore, but they use something called the fork, which is a Y shape, and you put like the head like this, and you lift them up and you hang them. And there's also
still
illustrations
just
of
as
that.
terrible.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you can,
it's more like a hanging.
But
type
you
thing.
can still say, well, it's not crucifixion.
Yeah.
Technically, it's
Yeah.
not a cross for us. Or,
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so you must have a high tolerance for speaking about studying like
Yeah.
grisly,
I guess I do.
bloody details.
Yeah.
There's one more book that I have here that I want to mention, although we did speak about it at quite some depth in the first episode, so everyone should watch the first episode on exploring the Quran and the Bible with Professor Anthony. But Muhammad and the Empires of Faith made a really big impact on the field, widely cited, really critical book. Is it California? Is this published by Berkeley? Yeah, so you see all my notes there. So, it's a terrific book I really encourage people to read. It's one of the, I think along with maybe Robert Hoyland and Fred Donner, the early histories or the histories of Islam's emergence that have made a really big impact. I want to speak about some things that aren't sort of like nerdy academic stuff about early Islam to get to know you better. So you're on Twitter. We're both on Twitter, X. What is your life on Twitter like for you?
It's gotten worse.
Okay.
Right now it's kind of a habit or an addiction that I feel like I need to cut myself off from, because it goes through these time periods where it becomes like a cesspool or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. Twitter is what I've used it for, is sort of like a micro blogging website where if I read something that I find to be interesting, and I have really no idea where I'm going to put it and something I'm going to write.
Right.
Or I have no idea if I'll ever really write something full on about it, or I just read something that I find interesting and I want to share with people. I feel like it's a great place to put up there.
Yes.
Sometimes, you embarrass yourself and you make mistakes, but then you learn something. And other times, you have really great conversations about this material and things like that. To me, I just find it a very interesting way of doing sort of like, free, open office hours online or something like this. And also, if I do eventually end up writing about the topics, I use it to search my little notes that I first, like things that I first ran out. I first started going on it because people in Saudi Arabia in particular were posting tons of epigraphy.
About
And
inscriptions.
they still are.
Yeah.
And a lot of this epigraphy has not been yet fully documented according to the academic standards that it has to be documented by. And it's extraordinary seeing this stuff put up there and how it enriches and challenges kind of our scholarship and our thinking and things like that. And that's kind of those posters have been a bit less prolific nowadays, and now I kind of feel like I'm just stuck with an addiction or a compulsion or whatever. But it's still very beneficial.
Well, I was going to give another argument for Twitter, because I'm on Twitter too.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, a really good part of it has been connecting with Muslim Twitter.
Yeah.
So, I'm not a Muslim, so I'm not part of the community, so I'm not like going to the masjid on Fridays or whatever and hearing, what's the latest, I don't know, chat about this or that.
Yeah.
But then you see it on Muslim Twitter. Sometimes people engage with me in a polemical way. I have pretty thick skin, unless it involves my family. Then I don't.
Yeah, there are lines.
But I mean, isn't this interesting? Like, the sort of world of Muslim believers in different places, diverse community that may not be in your classroom at Ohio State. It's usually not in my classroom at Notre Dame. What are your experience been?
I like that very much, and also I like the aspect of. So I consider because I work for a state school, I consider myself a public employee, and I try to take that seriously as someone who's a steward of taxpayer money and has a very privileged life. Thanks to
So
taxpayers
the dissemination of content
exactly. And even like when people want to ask me questions, I don't always have time. I can be busy or whatever, but also. I like being available to the public at large to answer their questions.
Right.
I mean, sometimes I don't have the answer per se, and like I said, sometimes I just don't have the time because I'm like creating a stack of papers or like I'm traveling or something. But I feel like I enjoy doing that. I enjoy being of some use to people. Though I do think. One of the problems is it can consume all your time, and then also I don't think it's my job to get on Twitter to be like the Twitter police and things like this.
I try to be disciplined with my phone just at home. Like I basically keep the phone downstairs. Anytime I go upstairs, it's not with me. And I know some people delete the Twitter app on their phone, so they only use it on their computer, which probably is a wise thing. I haven't done that. I haven't gone there. You travel a lot, I think, for academic purposes all around. Do you have a favorite country to visit?
Favorite country? It's the U.S., baby. You can't have it better than here.
Okay, number two.
Number two, the western part of the U.S. No, it's like
Texas.
Yeah, so I don't know. So I really like Japan. I don't get to go there very much.
Oh, you think of Japan?
Yeah, I do love Japan a lot.
Yeah. I just watched this movie at Notre Dame called Perfect Days.
Yeah.
Set in Japan. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it made me sort of curious. Yeah.
So I would say that the country that I haven't been able to visit, that has some of the best memories of, and I think is probably the most beautiful, well, definitely one of the most beautiful places after the United States that I've been to is Yemen. I would love to go back to Sana'a. I would love to travel throughout Yemen again. When I was there right before I started grad school.
Okay.
For an entire summer. It was an extraordinary country, extraordinary place. And I would love to go back.
Because of the nature, the high mountains,
Yemeni
culture.
Yeah, so there's two parts of it. So the west of it is around Sana'a, and there's limits to what I could travel at the time.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very high elevation. Sana'a is a beautiful old city full of these gingerbread houses, absolutely magical. And in general, the hospitality there is extraordinary. I mean, you spend most of your time being invited to people's houses and things like this. And then when you go east, you get to like Hawd Mount, and you go through the empty quarter in order to get there and stuff like that. And the landscape just totally changes. And it's extraordinary and it's beautiful in a totally different way.
More desert.
Yeah. And it's some of the best honey you've ever had in the world. And I don't know.
Best honey?
Honey. Oh,
honey.
Yeah. Extraordinary
awesome.
Honey. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I have very fond memories of Yemen in particular.
Is there a dish that you remember eating in Yemen?
Yeah, fahsa. I love fahsa.
What's that?
I don't know how to explain it. So there used to be this little place that I'd go to and eat at Sana'a where you had remember this Bedouin woman would sell bread that was like bigger than your body. You felt like it was so
Okay.
good. And you go and get this fasa. It's sort of like in a when I would eat it, it was in a cast iron bowl of sorts, and they cook it over a gas stove. And it has like a red sauce and meats and stuff in it. I don't know. I feel like I always call it the Mexican food of the Middle East because it's spicy. It's really good. And I just like taking like that hot pasta, putting it in like my bread. I would eat it like maybe like 2 or 3 times a week.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I just absolutely loved it. Yeah.
I haven't been to Yemen.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite food in the U.S.? Because you mentioned the U.S.
Oh.
Like a typically American thing.
You know, if I'm speaking the truth, I want to say something like cool and interesting. It'd have to be like pizza. I'm a lover of pizza of all types.
Okay.
Especially Chicago pizza.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Chicago
I love
pizza,
Chicago
like the
pizza.
inverted with the cheese on the inside?
Yeah,
and
yeah. That's the best.
Okay. All right. Okay. Is there one other place you visited that would be a backup to?
So I mean, I like every place. So I lived in Egypt for a really long time. I did my master's degree at the American University in Cairo. You know, Cairo and Egypt have a special place in my heart, my memory, and things like that. I love Lebanon. When I've been there, have been to Lebanon for a very long time.
Okay.
Syria, oh man, yeah, I really love Syria. I backpacked there multiple times. Spent a whole summer there as a grad student. Yeah.
Wandering around Syria?
Yeah, I did a lot of backpacking.
Mainly
in the Middle East. Yeah,
Damascus, Aleppo, or did you get to other places?
Yeah,
too?
Damascus, Aleppo, Hama. I spent a lot of time there. Yeah, mostly between like Halab and Damascus, though.
Okay.
Most of the time when I travel, I'd sleep on the roof because it's like really cheap if you sleep on the roof of the hostel rather than inside the hostel itself.
Okay.
And then like look at manuscripts in the day and things like
Wow.
that.
Yeah. I mean, I think hostels in Syria are already pretty cheap, so you're really.
Well, I mean, when you're doing it in the summer, I feel like the roof was a lot
Probably the
cooler
best
than
place.
the inside. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember sleeping. I've slept on roofs in Syria.
Yeah.
I have distant relatives who are in a village outside of Damascus, and in the summer we would sleep on the roof there. A lot of mosquitoes. I remember a lot of mosquitoes hiding under the blanket.
I mean, there are really so many like great cities, though. I mean, there's no place like Damascus. Istanbul is extraordinary. It's there's these places are amazing places, and I hope they have a bright future.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about controversial books. Patricia Corona and Michael Cook, years and years ago, I think in 1977, published Hagerism. Was it a good thing or a bad thing, in your opinion, for Islamic studies?
Yeah, it was totally good. I think. I mean, it was necessary. I think it was because I felt like this field was more or less asleep. It was kind of sleepwalking, and I think that without Hagerism...
Wait, what do you mean by sleepwalking? Would that be represented by someone like Montgomery Watt, who sort of just did history as though everything could be reconstructed as it really was, and without questioning?
I'm reluctant to... So I used to be really given to dumping on
Montgomery Watt. Yeah.
No, I'm saying like I used to be really... really keen on dumping on Montgomery Watt, but eventually you go and you read these older sources again that you think that you have this really great memory of. You're like, this is a lot better than I thought.
Okay.
I feel that about Watt actually a lot nowadays, even though I disagree with a lot of what he as his theses and things like that still. But yeah, I do feel it was a problem where something had shifted in Islamic studies, and this affected early Islam to where we tended to specialize in 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. And those were kind of the ideal for understanding kind of Islam. And the byproduct of that, unfortunately, was that it sealed off the early Islamic period from what later on people would call late antiquity.
Late antiquity, right.
And so there was an alternative model that fully integrated Islam with the late antique world, and also kind of the post-imperial history of, not really post-imperial, but it's kind of post-imperial history of early medieval Europe that was first really articulated by like Karl Heinrich Becker, but because he became more or less a politician, I think he did less scholarly stuff that he otherwise might have done in the course of his career. And I think that without Hegerism, the field would have been much less open to what was happening subsequently with late antiquity than otherwise it was. I think part of the reasons why people that work on the early Islamic period were open to embracing late antiquity as a paradigm or engaging with scholars of late antiquity who themselves often says we're not very sure whether or not early Islam should be a part of late antiquity or the end of late antiquity, whatever. Our openness to them more or less was due to, in large part, to Hegerism and its legacy. I don't think Hoyland would have ever written his very important book, like Seeing Islam as Others Saw It.
As Others Saw It.
You know, it's like where the sense of like we need to take all of the sources seriously.
Do you think they meant to provoke? You know, they write in their preface, don't they say something like, this is a book by infidels, for infidels?
Yeah. You know, I think this is a riff off of Montgomery Watt's preface, where he says that, I'm going to mess it up, but he says that he's tried to write that biography in a way that met the standards of Western historical methods, while at the same time remaining acceptable to the theological beliefs of Muslims.
Right.
I probably butchered that, but I think that they were trying to make themselves sort of the anti one. Yeah. And so and they were young too. They were really young when they wrote that.
They grad students still?
Yeah, I think they were still grad students. I remember asking Patricia about this once over dinner, and I hope I report her words correctly, but she always says that she felt that all of the most controversial statements people tended to blame on her when actually it was Professor Cook that wrote them. I don't know if I remember that correctly what she said. It was like if you read that book, I mean, you'll see some pretty extraordinary things in their prose stated pretty bluntly. But you know they had a nice style. I mean they both her and that book and also Patricia Cronin's like subsequent books like Slaves on Horses and things like that. Whatever the demerits, when you read them, you felt like there was something exciting happening in this field. You know?
Yeah, I mean in Hegerism, in some ways I feel like it's there's a giant piece missing because you don't really understand who's orchestrating all these moves, right? Yeah. Because there's like the Jewish Hegerism piece. Yeah. There's what they call the Samaritan calque, where they're drawing somehow from Samaritanism. Like, how are they doing all this at the same time? Yeah. Or maybe, one thing after another, but still, how are they doing it? Another controversial figure, Christoph Luxemburg, wrote the Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran. Was that a good thing or a bad thing for Quranic studies?
I have the opposite view. I don't think it did anything. I feel so bad about saying that.
Okay.
I think one of our problems, and I mostly think this, especially because of my friendship with Ahmed Al-Jalad and Brian Van Putte, there's a certain way of doing philology. It's very old and dusty that we're kind of used to in kind of classical kind of Oriental philology that is not properly engaged with linguistics as a field. And historical linguistics especially, but across the gamut. And I think that Luxemburg's book, despite the splash that it made, that's probably good, it's engaged neither with classical Oriental philology sufficiently nor with actual linguistics sufficiently. And has very little value in it. I mean, that sounds like so brutal.
Do you think that ultimately the book became popular because he argued that the so-called virgins or maidens in the Quranic paradise are actually grapes? Do you think
I think that definitely is. I mean, like, so there is a way to kind of make a splash with like a sensational claim, right? So I see this a lot with the politicization of biblical studies too, where if you
Gospel of Judas and other things, Jesus' tomb being found somewhere,
things like this, it's like all this type of material, like
Some of which have been shown to be inauthentic.
Yes,
I can't
exactly,
remember. I can't sort it
exactly.
all out.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. There's a way in which academic authority is supposed to put the thumb in its eye of religious authority in many ways, and people
Yeah.
kind of see it as like this is the job of secular academic work to really stick it to this old tradition and blah blah blah.
Okay.
That's not my view in any way whatsoever.
Okay.
And I think usually if you do have that view, your scholarship suffers in
Okay.
the end, because
Okay.
to me fundamentally you have to be driven by not like a desire to score points, but a desire to understand, and like
Yeah.
and see that as an intrinsic good, right? Like the thing that you're studying and learning about has this intrinsic value, not
That's
some
really interesting.
external
Not to be
goal.
taken for granted,
yeah.
Sean, in my
Yeah.
opinion, because I've been in a lot of religious studies
Yeah.
contexts where the first sort of vibe that you mentioned,
Yeah.
like we're sticking it to the religious people,
Yeah.
is a thing. So
Yeah.
it's a real,
Yeah.
It seems to me a real phenomenon in the world of religious studies.
Yeah, and it's a way of battling, because you have two different types of epistemological authority, right? Like you have people that they rely upon their authority to speak authoritatively about these religions based upon how they fit into a tradition that they supposedly represent, and then you have people that feel like they can make authoritative pronouncements based upon like whatever academic credentials that they have.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they see one another's credentials as sort of undermining or somehow incompatible with
Yeah.
with one another.
Yeah, there's a lot going
Yeah.
on there.
Yeah,
Circling back to Luxembourg, though, I mean, you're speaking about maybe not a total sophistication with linguistic questions. I mean, there are interesting examples where Quranic words are connected to either Syriac itself or Syro-Aramaic,
Yeah.
maybe to Hebrew in certain cases.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know, like Furqan,
Yeah.
for example, maybe. I think it's contested, but we have this Arabic word Furqan. On the base of Arabic, it seems to mean criterion or divider, but there's some verses about the day of the Furqan,
Yeah.
bringing down the Furqan, and
Yeah.
then the Syriac word Furqana means salvation or redemption. So, I mean, that's maybe a more modest claim than the grapes. The problem with the grapes is so much work is necessary,
Yeah.
right? Because not only does the Quran speak of hur ain, white eyes, as apparently a sort of circumlocution for these maidens of paradise, but it also speaks of marrying them, and it speaks of wildan, these young boys in paradise as well. So you've got to do so much work to get rid of the maidens. Also, sorry, I'm kind of rambling in different places here. I mean, Luxembourg has been accused in regard to that argument, particularly the grapes argument, of making certain presuppositions about what is proper and like what is decent, what is ethical. I think there's a line in the book somewhere where he says something like, it just couldn't be that there would be maidens in paradise. And people have responded like, well, who are you to decide what there could and couldn't be?
Yeah. I mean, so there's a larger, there's two issues I think that are broadly at work. One is that how does Arabic relate to all the other Semitic languages that it kind of existed alongside, right?
Right.
And the Arabian Peninsula itself was not uniformly Arabic speaking by any means, and it was multilingual. And we know that one of the more prominent Semitic languages that had penetrated the Arabian Peninsula for certain were different dialects of Aramaic.
Right.
Not just one, but many. And so how do we kind of trace that, and how do we kind of suss all that out? Number one. And so how do we also understand when Aramaic borrowings happen into Arabic, right? And are those borrowings contemporary with the Quran, or are they much older? Are they borrowed into Arabic many, many centuries before? That's another issue. And then there's the specific religious vocabulary of Aramaic as spoken by Jews and Christians that because the religions change and they develop new institutions and they have even new forms of worship and things like that. When does that kind of enter into the Quranic corpus or impact the Quranic corpus, things like that? Those are really difficult questions. And I don't think that what I object with a lot of the methods that I see in like Luxembourg and things like that, the way to resolve them is not finding an Arabic word, looking up its root in a Syriac dictionary and figuring it out.
Right. Okay.
Or looking at
Okay.
the consonantal outline, rearranging the dots so that I can look it up in a Syriac dictionary and
Yeah,
look it up. And then also the question to me always is your proposal more cogent than what we already have? So you have to bring something better. And a lot of times when I see these modifications that seem to be kind of a bit undisciplined and a bit unmoored from any sort of control, they don't necessarily arrive at a better solution than what we already had, right? So it proposes a solution, but it's not necessarily a good one.
Okay. Okay.
Like I find this a lot with, there's a famous series of articles by James Bellamy that is the same thing, where he kind of has his proposed emendations of the Quran.
So he solves,
Yeah.
from his point of
Yeah,
view, why
yeah. And I think
Jesus is called Isa.
Yeah,
right,
I think
is one
almost
of them.
all of his proposals are wrong. And I think almost all his proposals seem to imagine that the Quran in its earliest form was written in a style of Arabic script called Naskh, which is later. Like it didn't the presumptions of when he tries to do the emendations are not working with Hijazi script or Kufic script,
Okay,
but like with some
okay.
version of Naskh as he imagines it.
Yeah.
And so like it's just the question is to me, if we are going to make those assumptions that we can do the sort of text criticism, what are some of the self-imposed disciplinary limits that we need to set in order to know, like, yes, we've met an evidentiary bar.
And there's the question of, I think the term is loan shifts.
Yeah.
Right. So you could have a word which is authentically, whatever that means,
Yeah, yeah.
Arabic.
Yeah.
But it's because of the multilingual nature, intercultural exchange of the Arabian Peninsula
Yeah.
in the late 6th, early 7th century has taken on a flavor of meaning that might be borrowed without borrowing the word, but might be
Exactly.
borrowed. So, one example of this might be sakina.
Yeah.
So the Quran, I think it's sort of the Baqarah, associates the Ark. This is the Ark of the Covenant, not Noah's Ark. The Ark of the Covenant with this thing, a sakina,
Yeah.
which seems to be close to the Aramaic word shekhinah, which is
Yeah.
understood to be the presence of God that's associated with the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it just fits,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But then I think in another place, sakina, the Arabic meaning of tranquility, really fits.
Yeah. Clearly wins out. Yeah.
So, I mean, I just think that's an important,
that's a really good example.
important one to keep in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to think that, like I accept the criticisms that have been made of Luxembourg's book. I tend to think that the project was not like some sort of conspiracy. It was, just he was very confident of his emendations of the text. But I mean, I do think that the way it did prompt a debate that encouraged people to study Syriac.
Yeah, I think that's
So
a
that's
good,
something.
Yeah, get more serious about. And in general, this is something I think has happened in general, is that people that are interested in doing Quranic studies are now more likely to at least recognize in theory that they should have another language of one of the biblical traditions.
Right.
Right. So whether that's Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Greek, you name it, we all have this vision of the ideal scholar. Like there's this vision of the ideal scholar that I wish I was, that kind of hovers over me. This person that knows like Arabic perfectly and can read Greek easily and can read Syriac well and can read Aramaic and knows Hebrew and things like that.
Yeah.
If you ever meet that person, I'll hire them. Let me know. At least I'll do my best. but at least we have now this sense of this palpable need. Like, oh, we need to engage with this material.
Yeah.
And we need to put the training in place for our students and to reach out and try to gain the skills ourselves insofar as we can. And if we don't do that fully, then there's a lack in our scholarship. Like, it's not enough to read Baydawi and
right.
Zamakhshari, right?
Okay, so one last topic, and then we'll finally wrap up. I mean, if that is sort of a desired goal, that we sort of, I don't know, deviate from a traditional formation in the Islamic languages, engage with late antiquity, deal with languages like Hebrew, Ethiopic, Greek, Syriac. I mean, could one go a step further and say that basically, critical Quranic studies, early Islamic studies, is just a different thing than sort of the religious discourse? Do you see those as totally different worlds? And I ask this because, I mean, the truth is, like, the reality is that in the Western Academy, those two worlds are coming together.
Yeah.
So more and more, I mean, the new generation of scholars in the field of Islamic studies, overwhelmingly people of Muslim heritage, whether believers or not, but many are believers and doing sort of theological work. So, I mean, you see this at academic conferences, you see this on Twitter. Do you think that there's like a contamination there that could negatively affect critical studies of the Quran?
I don't think so, to be honest. Yeah, I think that both wings, if were functioning correctly and we're both thriving in our own way, we keep each other honest.
Interesting. That's really interesting perspective. Okay.
And so I think in general, one of the most important things that has happened to help balance our field, especially from scholars that are coming from within the tradition in particular, is this counsel to continue to take the philological and the exegetical insights of the Muslim tradition seriously and to not set them aside. In particular, I think this is in particular really important. To me, I still find it to be extremely important to literally scour the qira'at works, not just like the Mu'ajam, but also Abu Ali al-Farisi and Khalaway, like these types of guys. The stuff that they have is, in terms of their insights and what they document, is extraordinarily important. But also the tafsir tradition and the reception history of the Quran and things like this. I think that if you want to have a Quran that is radically at odds with what the early tradition says the Quran is, if you're interested in historical questions, that creates a problem. So how did this thing that you think is radically at odds with, I don't know, the 8th century, how did that transformation occur? To me, that's an extremely interesting historical question. But I think too many people see that as kind of an annoyance. Well, if I had to answer that question, then I can't do my little project or something like that.
Yeah.
But to me, I'm very interested in the full story.
So let me ask a related question, but in the context of your teaching at Ohio State, or the Ohio State University. What do you see your task is in courses on Islam or the Quran? I presume you have Muslim and non-Muslim students all together. Do you feel that like the right classroom community in dealing with religious studies at a state university in the United States, public university, is everyone should sort of leave their religious baggage at the door, and we should just act as though we had no personal religious convictions? Or is it somewhere different where everyone can be freely open as believers? And how do you see your task as an instructor?
I would say, first of all, I'm still figuring it out. Probably still will always be figuring it out. But so particularly, let's say when I teach the Quran or whatever, because I am non-Muslim, I teach. So at Ohio State, we have a pretty big mixture of students that come from a Muslim background and students that don't. And a lot of times, I'll only have more Muslim students than non-Muslim students. I don't see it as like my job to be a ventriloquist for Muslims. Right. So first and foremost, I try to present what I think is the Western scholarly tradition and its approach.
Okay.
And that's not in Quranic studies particularly,
But
just
that's coherent
historical-
because you say
yeah.
if you wanted simply the Islamic tradition,
Yeah.
why would you come to me?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, what I'm offering is something
Yeah,
different.
I can't. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. But really, for me, that's just historical criticism writ large. It's
Okay,
not like
okay.
Quranic studies per se, but what is historical criticism? What are modern historical methods, and how do we evolve them? However, I very much welcome people approaching the topic from whatever direction it interests them. Like I encourage my Muslim students to share their beliefs and also to disagree strongly if they want to with like our approaches and perspectives. Because what I try to tell them is that you help the other students that don't share your faith to realize that these are questions that have stakes. Right? So this is the study of this text has, stakes, and they learn this from you in ways that I can't communicate to them as like the sage on stage. And so they need to engage with you as well. And then what you learn from them is sort of what it's like to kind of encounter this text maybe raw, maybe for the first time. I mean, honestly, for the most part, I really struggle with this current generation of students getting people to speak candidly in public.
Oh, because people are too polite.
Yeah, people are overly polite. Yeah, I want them to be a bit more disagreeable. I don't want them to try to. I mean, you do have sometimes students that try to take over the class themselves, and they need to be brought to heel.
Yeah.
But in general, it's like the shyness and the hesitancy to kind of speak up and things like that.
Yeah. One of the first Muslim students I taught here at Notre Dame a long time ago was someone named Ryan Harris, who was a football player. I don't know if you heard of him. He was offensive lineman. They never get credit as offensive lineman, but he went on. He converted to Islam when he was in high school in Minnesota. We knew the Somali community in Minneapolis and became Muslim. And he went on to play in the NFL and won a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning when he was with the Denver Broncos. And then came back and he's now a broadcaster, so came back and has visited me a couple of times. He actually participated in my Quran reading group one time, just recently. Last year he came back and read some Quran with us. And but I think his disposition from my memory was, very much in student mode, wasn't challenging much. I find that in class, Notre Dame, it's probably a different experience because they're at a Catholic institution. So we talk a lot of theology. Yeah. And I find when speaking theologically, there's just a lot of common questions. For example, about the nature of God, the problem of theodicy, the problem of evil. The question of God is whether God is anthropomorphic, human-like in any way. The question of ethics, how you derive ethics, if it's from scripture or from reason, principally. So I feel there's almost like a meta level of discourse that I get in the classroom that can work with my students here at Notre Dame. Is there something I should have touched on? Anything you want to say about your books, future projects, maybe as a final note?
Yeah, I guess I'll say to my future projects. So not so related to Quranic studies, but so the next two books are Stephen Shoemaker and I have translated what is ostensibly a contemporary account of the Persian conquest of Jerusalem in 614. That's going to be coming out soon. Wow. It's preserved in two versions. One of the versions is in Old Georgian. That's Shoemaker's task. Okay. And then the other one is in multiple Arabic recensions. And so I translated the Arabic recensions. Hopefully that'll be coming out very soon, maybe this year. And also another translation, one of the earliest accounts of the life of a caliph named Omar ibn Abdulaziz, an Umayyad caliph. It's going to be coming.
Very important caliph, yeah. Sort of the good
the
Umayyad.
Good guy. Yeah, the good Umayyad.
The pious Umayyad.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll put links to those. Or at least we'll put descriptions of those, and if you update us, we'll put links to them when they do come out. And we'll have links to the books that are already published here on the table. And this was great. Thank you, Sean.
My pleasure, as usual.